In my first video on police, I said this. A bad cop enforces unjust legislation. All cops take an oath to enforce all legislation. Most legislation is unjust. All cops are bad cops. Police who enforce unjust legislation are bad people. After all, they're victimizing people who cannot be objectively proven to have done anything wrong. While all police do take an oath to enforce unjust legislation, many don't. For this, they deserve our thanks for achieving the bare minimum of socially acceptable behavior. But this just means they won't do their job. So cops either enforce unjust legislation, which makes them bad people, or they don't, which makes them bad cops. Pick one. Oh hi, I'm the Heretic, and Rational Outlaw made a reply to my videos on police. If you have not seen my videos, I'll link them down below. But the point I make is that police in general, but especially in the US, are unethical, and the existence of their profession is unjust. They are a hostile, occupying army in our society, and we would not only be freer, but safer without them. But I know Rational Outlaw, or rather, I met him a few times. Let's see what he's got to say. Hit it.
If they were beating people and killing people and stealing from people en masse, then yeah, you could have a leg to stand on. But they're not, for the most part.
That you had to say, for the most part, at the end, tells me everything I need to know. You know what's going on. They do kill people en masse. They are beating people en masse. Stealing from people, and you know they are, just not for the most part. Trouble is that en masse is an arbitrary standard that's made for shifting goalposts. How will I know when the murder rate of cockroaches is en masse? It's a useless standard, meant to deflect the cognitive dissonance I'm certain Rational Outlaw is experiencing. He knows full well that cops steal, murder, and assault, but by creating the arbitrary standard of en masse, or for the most part, he can give the impression to us and to himself that it's really not as bad of a problem as I and other cockroach critics make it out to be, and therefore not a problem worth examining or stopping. This allows the problem of sociopaths being given effective exemptions from legislation against assault, battery, theft, rape, and murder go on, safely ignored. This is what makes this argument so dangerous. If their criminality rate was as low, if not lower, than the average American, then Outlaw might have had a point. The opposite is true, however, and it still would not excuse the fact that cops act unjustly by nature of their very profession.
What they are doing is arresting people for drug possession, drug use, and the sale of drugs.
Which of course is unethical. What victims am I creating for swallowing 2 aspirin pills for my headache? Why should I be locked in a cage because of it? Why should I be locked in a cage or otherwise deprived of my property for possessing aspirin? Obviously, I'm harming nobody if I'm selling aspirin because the buyers perceive a benefit to the aspirin greater than the money they're giving to me. Otherwise, the transaction wouldn't have happened. Yet according to the logic of anti-drug legislation, the state needs to escalate force against me until I comply with their kidnapping of me or kill me for using, having, or selling aspirin. Now obviously, there's no legislation banning aspirin yet, but it serves to illustrate my point about drug legislation.
I think those things should be legal, yes.
Well, I have a problem with the concept of legalization, but it's not worth quibbling over. So, what's the problem?
I think those things should be legal, yes. However, not everyone thinks the same. Some people believe it is immoral. In fact, actually, most people think it is immoral. So you can't just judge them on plainly things like that.
What most people think is immoral is irrelevant. Right and wrong is not up for a vote. The burden of proof is on the government and their armed enforcers such as the police departments, to justify why someone who possesses a form of property they don't like ought to be kidnapped by government agents and locked in a cage. Possession of what the government arbitrarily calls illicit substances creates no victims. So according to natural law, the government cannot be acting in the defense of others. As such, the claim that people who possess illicit substances are engaged in criminal activity is incorrect, since it cannot be justified without appealing to circular reasoning. Cockroaches that enforce the unjust will of the priesthood of statism who put forward unjust legislation are acting criminally.
And of course, you're not just talking about that. You're trying to say that they're killing and beating people in mass, which is absolute lie. And your generalization of all cops is absolutely disgusting of you. Even if I was an Ancap and I believed what the cops were doing was bad, I wouldn't call them all bad people.
Now, I never said all cops were bad people. I said cops were not the good guys, or that all cops are bad cops. Neither of which are character judgments per se. Perhaps that's how you interpreted what I said, but I never said what you think I said. And I opened the scripts for both those videos just to be sure.
Heck, I wouldn't even call all politicians bad people. To say that they're all bad people because they're doing a few things that you think is wrong doesn't mean they're bad people.
I never claimed they're doing anything that I think is wrong either. They're doing things that they have failed to prove are just, and therefore they must be acting unjustly. I don't have a crystal ball into the hearts and minds of people, so I have no way of knowing their motives, but I seriously question the morals of someone who continuously and persistently acts unjustly, let alone as a career choice. When you bring up perfection, it's specifically to deflect criticism.
No, he's bringing up the perfection thing because a lot of people seem to think that cops should be absolutely perfect and that there should never be any wrong, which, quite frankly, you are thinking, from what it seems.
This is actually pretty funny. He plays my video, which is just my voice, over a cockroach brutality compilation, and Outlaw thinks my problem is that legislation enforcers aren't perfect? My problem with cockroaches, Christ, I can't believe I have to spell this out, is that their profession requires them to act unjustly. I have the same problem with them as I do with burglars, kidnappers, and politicians. Private sector professionals, such as accountants, bank tellers, retail clerks, waiters, hospital nurses, all do not require those employed to act unjustly. I don't expect people, in general, to be perfect, but when they have a job to do, I expect them to do it. Likewise, I expect cockroaches to do their job. Trouble is, I'd rather they don't, because their job is unethical.
You can't expect someone to be doing the right thing all the time.
I can expect people to be just all the time. When there is injustice, I expect the perpetrator to compensate their victim. This isn't a high standard, but if cockroaches were to actually meet it, they couldn't do their jobs, since the vast majority of their job requires them acting out injustice. Oh, what am I saying? There's a new police brutality story at least once a day.
Yeah, that's utter bull. Even the Times, a left-leaning site, says that police brutality is rare.
The Free Thought Project is a veritable treasure trove of police brutality and blue privilege stories, with new ones coming out at least once a day. You tried to characterize any sources I might be using as left-leaning to create the genetic fallacy, trying to appeal to people's tribal allegiances to the right wing, even though the political spectrum is useless as a framework for understanding political thought. Suffice to say, there's more than you know. Just because you don't see it on the Drudge Report, or the controlled opposition group Black Lives Matter isn't actively protesting about it, doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
And let's not forget that there's over 600,000 police officers in the United States. Of course there's going to be some police brutality because there is going to be some bad cops.
Which is accurate. I had a tendency to overemphasize the negatives without putting it into perspective. There are, according to the source you cited, 780,000 active duty police officers. Reasonable enough. The number of interactions between cockroaches and people is somewhere in the tens of millions per year. Figure half of them are not police initiated. The probability of anything happening to you in any one interaction is extremely small. Likewise, there are things you can do to mitigate your risk of harm. For starters, not going to places in the US with the truly psychotic police departments, like Chicago, Illinois, Baltimore, Maryland, or Maricopa County, New Mexico. You're a lot safer in, say, rural Tennessee or Greenwich, Connecticut. Anyways, being polite and decent rather than hostile and belligerent will help you in just about every interaction in life, including with cockroaches. I get that every encounter is not a life or death situation. If my audience didn't understand that previously because I failed to communicate that, well, then surely they understand now. But that said, my problem with cockroaches isn't just the brutality, per se. It's the injustice. I fear either you missed the point of my video entirely, or it wasn't communicated clearly enough.
If you don't have good people in the force, you're going to have bad people only. You can't just convince everyone to, suddenly think that the government is entirely bad. Let's dismantle it. That's never going to happen. So to blame all cops because they have to enforce these laws is ridiculous.
The problem isn't that there are bad mafia enforcers. It's that there are mafias. Their job requires them to commit injustices. Outlaw is ignoring the causal factors of badge abuse. Although I haven't shown it, he does agree with me about the problems with police training, that officers are trained to view everyone as enemy combatants, or that cockroaches are more inclined to criminal activity when they see their coworkers flexing their blue privilege to avoid jail after being charged with rape, theft, or murder, assuming those charges aren't just dropped due to qualified immunity shenanigans. The problem is not that there are a few bad apples that ruin the bunch. The incentives government legislation enforcement creates attracts the bad apples Outlaw is justly afraid of, while encouraging the turning of good people into monsters. Philip Brailsford was previously a Mormon missionary before joining the Maricopa County Police Department, which turned him into a cold-blooded killer who would go on to murder a father of two with a rifle he etched the words, "You're f***ed" on. Get rid of the bad people and replace them with only good ones. You're only buying time before the good people either turn bad or get out while they still have their souls intact to be replaced by bad people. The idea that simply replacing the bad people is going to solve an institutional problem is absurd, completely disregarding observable reality. If the problem was that the wrong people were cockroaches, then why would they have a conviction rating of 0.1% in government courts? Why would monthly arrest quotas exist and entire police departments be fired by their town governments for refusing to meet them? It doesn't explain anything, let alone why the unjust legislation they exist to enforce exists to begin with. I can assure you, it's not the bad apples who regularly shut down and fine lemonade stands for not having business licenses, or who throw fathers in overcrowded prisons for possessing a plant. And yes, I'm gonna call marijuana a plant, because that's what it is. There aren't enough bad apples in California to throw their homeless in jail for a crime of being homeless, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't bad apples who poured bleach on the food of homeless people.
And I'm pretty sure there are probably cops who disagree with some of the laws they have to enforce.
Now, one might believe if we could just get good people into the system, they can change it from within. But consider the following scenario. Suppose I am smoking marijuana in the comfort of my own home. The SWAT team that comes to arrest me and shoot my dog consists entirely of anti-drug war activists trying to work their way through the system. They're enforcing an ordinance passed by a politician who's trying to work his way through the system to end the drug war, but agreed to pass that legislation on the promise of future payouts. The judge adjudicating my case and the prosecutor are all anti-drug war activists working their way through the system. As they convict me and throw me in jail, the bailiff taking me away also opposes the drug war and is working his way through the system, as are the prison guards who keep me locked in a cage for 10 years for crimes that they all disagree with. Now, one might argue that in the absence of all these people working their way through the system, someone else would have done it, which is fair, except their disagreement with the system's policy didn't do me any good, did it? Injustice was still inflicted upon me entirely by people who would otherwise agree with my views because of the system. Only the absence of the system itself could have prevented this injustice. Their disagreement isn't worth squat if they continue to act unjustly. As the state itself so eloquently demonstrated during the Nuremberg trials following World War II, evil is not excused because one was just following orders.
So, in conclusion, you're a bag. I used to like you, filthy heretic, but you've gone absolutely bonkers.
Whoa, okay, that's not fair. You clearly misheard what I said, so please don't draw your opinions of me based on that.
And if you're wondering why I didn't respond to the rest of his video or his second video, I either agreed with it or he was just talking about the things that some police officers have done.
Great. So you understand that cockroaches, or more specifically US cockroaches, are the most murderous demographic in the world by a huge margin. You understand that 40% of cockroach spouses are victims of domestic abuse. You understand that whether or not someone is complying with an officer is entirely up to their arbitrary discretion. That legislation enforcers can arrest you, or at least make you subject to an involuntary interaction with them for any reason they wish, regardless of if you're in compliance with government legislation or not. The Supreme Court stated that cockroaches can press criminal charges against you for violating legislation, even if they don't know what the legislation is or even if it exists. Cockroaches can kill people for any reason they wish, and that you are vastly more likely to be killed by an officer than a mass shooter or an Islamic terrorist. That government legislation enforcers do not enforce laws. They enforce the arbitrary whims of politicians. Government legislation is rarely enforced against cockroaches who almost never get convicted of the crimes they commit. Cockroaches use threats and intimidation to coerce people into voiding their own Bill of Rights granted protections. Through civil asset forfeiture, cockroaches can take your property, including but not limited to your car or even your home, if they think it might have been involved in a crime without ever accusing you of a crime. The malintentioned are incentivized to seek positions within police departments. Police departments actively push out good cops. Local governments rely on arrest quotas to fund themselves and will fire entire police departments for failing to do so. Cockroaches kill dozens of dogs a day, and ultimately, that if civil protection and security were provided by private companies rather than government agents, the result would be far, far, far less injustice. It seems to me the only problem you have with my video is that you think I made a generalized moral judgment about cockroaches, which I didn't, so what's the problem? Well, I couldn't say, but he definitely took my criticism of government legislation enforcement personally. Likely, he has some family he's close with who are, or were, government legislation enforcers. Unfortunately, there's nothing I can do about that. Are there good people who enforce government legislation? Sure there are. The idea that every single police officer is evil is just silly. However, what I can say with absolute certainty, as a general statement, every cockroach is required by the nature of their profession to commit injustices. Those that don't, well, they might be good people, but they're lousy cockroaches. No amount of huffing about generalizations can get around this. But I'm curious to know more. Rational Outlaw, if you're watching this, how would you like to schedule a debate with me about the merits of government policing? I'll be happy to discuss this further. I'll include my Discord contact info in the description. Let me know if you're feeling up to it. Anyways, Let me know what you've thought in the comments below. Support me on Patreon. Like, share, and subscribe to become a heretic today. Also, a quick aside, a 38-second intro, that's pretty excessive.